Previously on The Lost Kids.
Synanon began here on the beachfront in Santa Monica in 1958 as a bold and controversial new program for rehabilitating drug addicts and alcoholics. But as time went on, the controversy grew stronger and the praise grew fainter because Synanon changed.
Nothing was going to stop me until they were exposed.
At what point did you start to feel like that your life was in danger?
I was getting threatening phone calls.
What did these phone calls say?
We're going to kill you.
There are 65 youngsters in Sea-Doo, all of them hardcore drug users for whom this program was a last chance. The founder is Mel Wasserman, a former Palm Springs furniture dealer who started the program in 1967.
What the fuck was Sea-Doo?
Good morning. My name is Cynthia Clark Harvey. Thank you, Chairman Miller, and those committee members present today.
In 2007, Cynthia Clark Harvey addressed a packed congressional hearing in Washington, D.C.
Our story is a personal tragedy, but please remember that for each family that has suffered the ultimate damage, the death of a beloved child.
The hearing was organized by Congressman George Miller to investigate abuse and neglect in the so-called troubled teen industry. When Cynthia took the stand, the room full of Republican and Democratic lawmakers went dead quiet.
Our firstborn, Erica, was an amazing kid. Everyone says that about their own, but it's true, she was. So many times during Erica's too short life, she'd do or say or create something that just knocked our socks off.
Cynthia's story has some striking similarities to the Ewens. Like Daniel, her daughter Erica was a loving, well-adjusted, bright kid until she hit puberty.
But Erica's bright light seemed to flicker when at 14 and in the 8th grade, she began to experience mental health problems. Erica became depressed, then suicidal. She engaged in cutting behaviors. To medicate herself, she began abusing and using illegal drugs.
Like Daniel Ewen's parents, Cynthia and her husband were desperate to find a program to help their child. And they were relieved when they thought they found a legitimate treatment facility.
We eventually focused in on Catherine Freer Wilderness because they were, and continue to be, leaders in the industry. They told us our daughter would be treated by experienced staff, experienced therapists, and experienced wilderness guides and emergency medical technicians. They told us we could trust our most precious firstborn daughter, Erica, to them.
On May 26, 2002, Cynthia escorted her daughter to the program in Nevada. She was advised by the program not to tell Erica where they were going.
Of all the many profound and tormenting regrets we have about our terrible decision, agreeing to deceive Erica is one of the worst. When we told her why we were there, she was shocked, angry, and scared. We will be haunted as long as we live by Erica's cry of, "Please, Daddy, don't make me go." On May 27, 2002, the first full day of Erica's Nevada wilderness trek, Freer's trusted team mistook a dire medical emergency for teenage belligerence, and Erica died that afternoon of heat stroke with dehydration.
Erica fell headfirst down a deep ravine, where she lay for 45 minutes without anyone taking action. The on-call doctor was eventually alerted, but it turned out he wasn't a real doctor, and when authorities were contacted, staff weren't able to provide GPS coordinates. It took hours for a helicopter to arrive, and by then, it was too late. Cynthia Clark Harvey's testimony proved to be part of a disturbing pattern in the underregulated, private, troubled teen industry. The U.S. Government Accountability Office launched an investigation into the billion-dollar industry, and they uncovered thousands of allegations of abuse and neglect. So how could Daniel Ewen's parents have been sold on a program in 2004 in an industry that already for decades had been mired in scandal? I'm Josh Bloch, and this is The Lost Kids, a podcast from UCP Audio. Episode 5. Lots of tough and almost no love.
So I'm Maia Szalavitz, and I'm the author of Help at Any Cost, How the Troubled Teen Industry Cons Parents and Hurts Kids.
Maia Szalavitz is an investigative reporter, and this book, which she published in 2006, played a major role in exposing the long and troubled history of the troubled teen industry. And in fact, it was her work, along with advocates, parents, and former residents, that helped spur on those congressional hearings in 2007 and 2008. Like government investigators, Maia uncovered rampant abuse and limited regulation for an industry that started back when CEDU began in the 1960s. I reached out to her to find out how these kinds of tough love programs have been able to operate for so long and grow into such a lucrative industry. You say in the title of your book that the troubled teen industry cons parents. I'm curious to know, what is the con?
Well, the con is that you can send your kid away and we'll fix them for you. And that they'll come back and you'll have your child back. What they do is, the parent is ashamed because teen problems are very stigmatized, addiction's very stigmatized. They don't want to mobilize their social network to find good care because they're embarrassed that they have the problem and they think it's their fault in the first place. And then here you have a place that says, nope, it's not your fault. Your kid is rotten and we'll fix them. Just pay this amount of money, send them away, and we will return them and they will be better.
Maia says not only do they promise to fix your kid, but in most cases the remedy is the same: tough love. Is that a coincidence?
So I had an addiction when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and most of what I heard about what drug treatment consisted of was horrifying to me. The idea was public humiliation, screaming at you, telling you to scrub the floor with a toothbrush, telling you all kinds of terrible things about yourself, and really a lot of public attacks. So I was really curious about why this was such a common model in the addictions field. And so then I learned about Synanon, which was a cult in California that became famous for its so-called addiction cure. And I learned that basically Synanon was the basis of most of the addiction treatment field that is called therapeutic communities. In other words, they were founded by people who went to Synanon, or trained by people who went there, or trained by people who were trained by people who went there. So there was almost always a direct connection. And when these were originally set up, they were proud of their connection to Synanon. But then when Synanon became more famous for putting a rattlesnake in the mailbox of one of its enemies, they started to sort of hide those connections a little bit more.
Some organizations did hide those connections. Interestingly, even today, former staff from CEDU are proud of that link. Either way, after Mel Wasserman opened the CEDU family of services in California and Idaho, these kinds of programs really caught on. A whole new industry was born. Wilderness programs like Challenger, Summit Quest, and North Star expeditions, Christian programs like Love in Action, and residential facilities like The Seed in Florida, started by a comedian and funded by the U.S. government. You've mapped out this connection to Synanon. It's so interesting to see, how everything kind of, all roads lead back to that organization, but also the different generations of the troubled teen organizations that come out of it.
It's really interesting because these organizations have a very specific history. So at first the press is like, wow, this is this amazing new tough treatment, and here are the success stories. Then in a couple of years you get former employees talking about abuse, you get former participants talking about abuse, you get this whole wave of scandal, and then it gets shut down and reopens under a new name or with a slightly different twist. But the thing is that this is all based on this idea that teenagers are lying, manipulative creatures who need to be broken down to be made straight.
Maia's research found virtually no scientific support for this kind of therapy. But that didn't stop the famous and powerful from endorsing it.
There they're arriving, as you can see, the red carpet out, the Secret Service men moving in. Security, as you can imagine, extremely tight here.
In 1985, First Lady Nancy Reagan and Princess Diana visited a facility in Springfield, Virginia called Straight Inc. It was one of the largest tough love programs for teens in America. Straight claims that it treated 50,000 teens in its facilities across the U.S.
There's the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, and there's the Princess of Wales.
Without a hat today, Jack.
Yes.
It's very exciting because it does, in fact, show off this facility that is doing so much for the young people and their families. Straight was one of the first places that I went to when I became involved with a drug problem. So I have a very soft spot in my heart for it.
By the mid-1980s, Straight became one of Nancy Reagan's favorite drug rehab programs.
Not long ago in Oakland, California, I was asked by a group of children what to do if they were offered drugs.
I was a kid when the First Lady joined the war on drugs in America, and her simple, straightforward message was first uttered.
And I answered, just say no.
And I remember Nancy Reagan's catchphrase was everywhere.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
What I didn't know back then was that the Just Say No tagline was connected to these so-called tough love programs.
And it was being boosted by federal officials throughout the Reagan and Bush years, even though from the very start there were reports of kidnappings, beatings, people being restrained till they wet and soiled themselves, just all kinds of horrible stuff that we don't allow even for adult prisoners, but this was being done to teenagers.
Straight Inc. closed its doors in 1993 in scandal. They ended up paying millions of dollars to former residents, who sued them for things like malpractice, abuse, false imprisonment, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Straight is the perfect example of that pattern that Maia was talking about. The media gets really excited about a new program for so-called troubled teens. Then years later, staff and residents come forward with accounts of abuse. The program shuts down, and the staff move on and create new programs, often carbon copies of the original. Maia says Straight was modeled on a program called The Seed. The Seed gets shut down, but supporters of the program create Straight. Then Straight gets shut down, and similar programs like Kids Inc. and Pathway Family Center are created, and so on.
Literally tens of thousands of teens are in these programs at any given time. Because they are not regulated, though, it's very hard to tell how many of them actually exist. And a lot of times, because of the reputation that this kind of stuff has correctly gotten, people will try to, give things a new name or distinguish themselves or say that, of course we don't do that. But of course your kid can't communicate with you, so you won't be able to find out if they won't do that. And by the way, your kid's going to lie to you about abuse anyway.
And who tends to own these organizations and who staffs them?
So it's a variety. There are some people who genuinely believe that this is the best thing to do and this is the only way to help. And so there's these sort of true believer types. And then there are people who just want to make money. People don't need a high school education. People don't need any education other than what they're taught by the staff there. They often hire former participants who pretty much have very little education by the time they are out of there. And so, you've got cheap staff, you've got a cheap location. In fact, having bad food or other terrible conditions is a plus because you're supposed to be being harsh. So it's a very easy way to make money.
It's so interesting to hear, the connection to Synanon and what ends up happening to Synanon is, of course, many critics end up calling it one of the most dangerous cults in America. It ends up shutting its doors in the early 90s. But the tough love philosophy continues on.
There's a bunch of different reasons for that. One is that the blame is placed entirely on the child. So the parents are not at fault. This is the kid's problem. Everything that goes wrong has been caused by this kid's bad behavior. So it fits in with a very individualistic, capitalistic way of seeing things. There's another piece to it, though, where a lot of parents can't deal with the fact that their kids are growing up. And they really can't deal with the fact that their kids are becoming sexual beings, and now they're getting into trouble and causing problems. And so there's a sort of anger at youth itself that kind of gets expressed in these programs. I think, America is just really attracted to this idea that the problem is in the individual, and that if we're just super mean to people, that will fix them. We do this with addiction, and we do this with poverty, and we do this with all kinds of things for which it is completely ill-equipped to work. And then, of course, we blame the victims for it not working. And to be fair, I've just really sort of focused only on the dark side. Most of the parents that send their kids to these places have really wanted to do the right thing. And they really thought that they were helping their children by sending them to these places because they were told by authorities like Nancy Reagan and other people in the drugs world that this is what worked.
I want to ask you a bit more about the actual tough love form of therapy, the attack or encounter therapy that takes place in many of these programs. Certainly takes place in CEDU, where it's called a rap session. Of course, in Synanon, it's called the game. Can you explain the mechanics of how an encounter therapy group works?
There's many different ways, but the most intense form is where one person is put on the so-called hot seat, and then everybody in the group is instructed to tell that person how awful they are and how bad their behavior is and just what a shame of a human they are. So the idea is that if we tell you how bad you are, you will break down and stop behaving that way, and your personality will be reformed. In the original Synanon, there was this idea that the heroin addicts that they were seeing were people who, were just thieves and manipulative and antisocial, and that they had this sort of hardcore street identity that needed to be attacked so that a new pro-social identity could be built. Now, that may have been true of some people with heroin addiction, but it's certainly not true of your average teenager. And your average teenager really doesn't have much of an identity. They're trying to build one. And you take somebody who really hasn't developed an identity yet and just keep telling them, you're a liar, you're manipulative, you're scum, you're the lowest thing on earth, you don't deserve anything, your parents are a wreck because you're such a bad person. I mean, this just eats at you.
Looking into this whole story, I heard a lot about rap sessions and why those who led the sessions believed they worked. Rudy Bentz worked at CEDU for 15 years.
I always felt what we did was we didn't give the child room to get around the truth. It works. Why? I'm not sure. Was it abusive? To me, no, even though some people and some kids I know who would confront me on online, Facebook, stuff like that, thought it was very abusive. I don't think I ever abused anybody. I would push and push and push, and I would demand honesty, and I would demand what I would call ownership. They're your feelings. They're your behaviors. You own them. Don't put that crap on me or your buddy over here. How do you feel about that?
The problem is that, what they believe is honesty is not honesty. So the idea that I say to my husband, yes, you do look fat in that, is like this great truth that will reveal something wonderful. No, we have social conventions for a reason. And yes, people do need outlets to share their emotions, but people's emotions about what is true are very complicated. It's a view of emotion that is not the way emotion actually works, because we sort of have this view that like anger is like steam in a boiler and you need to let it off. In fact, the more you express anger, the more angry you become. And while, yes, if you are in a group of people that you can trust and in a place where you can talk about your deepest secrets and be vulnerable, that can be enormously healing. You don't generally create that environment by attacking people. The problem here is that you've got lots of tough and almost no love.
Just like there are staff out there who defend the use of tough love with teenagers, there are also former residents who say that CEDU worked for them. Heather Damien went to CEDU in the early 90s.
And I want to play you a clip of what she said about her experience.
Okay.
For me, there are more good things than there were basically negative. I learned so much just about the tools that they gave you through these experiences. I am very grateful that it was hard work. It was probably one of the hardest things I did as a kid, but it was one of the best things because it gave me, I think, an edge on life. And I can read people very well. I can see through things very well. And, you know, for being a young girl, a teenager, actually trying to like figure out who you are and knowing who you are when you're that young, I think that's pretty powerful.
If you look at sort of the research on these large group awareness trainings that use a lot of these same techniques, lots of people say they were psychologically helped. But if you talk to their wives and their children and everybody else, they say that they didn't change. They just say that they believe that they changed. How does she know that her changes didn't just come from growing up? She doesn't, unless she has like 20 identical twins who went through different approaches and didn't have that experience, right? You know, this is why I believe in treatment for these kinds of things. We need to rely on data rather than anecdote. Now, it is possible that, you know, some people just do grow from this and do have, you know, a positive experience, but the amount of abuse that occurs cannot possibly justify one person saying it was good for them.
Right.
Our first witness will be Mr. Gregory Coxe, who is currently the Managing Director of GAO's Forensic Audits and Special Investigation Unit. Mr. Coxe has testified.
In 2007, after lobbying by child's rights activists, former residents, and in the wake of Maia's book, Democratic Congressman George Miller convened that congressional hearing to investigate the troubled teen industry.
Boys at one boot camp were required to stand with bags over their head and a hangman's noose around their neck. The rope on this noose was tightened to simulate a hanging. The individual responsible for this told officers that this was an appropriate form of discipline. Another boy was forced to lie face down on a red anthill and was not allowed to brush the ants off of his face or his body. In a separate incident, this boy was required to lie on his stomach for 10 hours. He was only allowed to get up to vomit, and then he was required to clean up his vomit before he got down on the ground again.
The hearing shed a light on some of the darkest corners of the troubled teen industry.
Mr. Coxe, in one of the narratives in your report, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that in fact drug tests were administered to one of the students repeatedly. The drug tests were negative and they were reported as positive to the parents. Is that correct, including the initial?
That's correct. And also what was just described here, we did see evidence where kids were forced to confess to things far worse than they had actually done. That was significant evidence that not just the kid we looked at, but a number of kids in that program were forced to do that at the admission process.
What was it like to attend those hearings?
I mean, it was great to see, for me, obviously, it was personally satisfying to have gotten such a result and to see that we were able to make a difference. The stories, of course, were as horrifying as we knew they were. And the industry representative was woefully overmatched, which was great to see.
Yes, sir, we do not
do you don't do your own investigation?
We do not do our own investigations, sir.
You don't do your own looking at the quality of these organizations?
No, sir, we do not.
Essentially self-certify?
They are not certified by our organization. We are not an accrediting agency. We're not a licensing agency.
What the hell do you do?
Following the hearing, George Miller introduced a bill to regulate the industry. In the past dozen years, that bill has passed through the Congress twice, but never gotten any further. Some Republican lawmakers say they oppose federal regulation, saying it should be left up to each state. But advocates say there's another reason that it's been difficult to regulate the industry.
I would say to you, by way of being transparent, we've had crosswinds in our lives.
That's Vice President Mike Pence in a promotional video from 2016 for a therapeutic boarding school called Crosswinds, located in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Thank you for standing behind Crosswinds. Thank you for standing behind all the vulnerable families that they're touching all across the state of Indiana. This is an extraordinarily important...
Critics of the industry say its powerful connections to people like Mike Pence that may have stymied efforts to regulate the industry in the past. And those connections go well beyond Mike Pence. Mel Sembler, the founder of Straight Inc., the program Nancy Reagan endorsed, is a longtime Republican fundraiser who had close ties to George H.W. Bush.
Melvin Sembler, a Florida real estate developer, nominated ambassador to Australia. His only international experience was as president of the International Council of Shopping Centers. He gave $127,000 to Republicans.
There is no such thing as physical punishment. There's only physical restraint.
Robert Litchfield is the founder of the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs. It was one of the largest organizations in the troubled teen industry.
When you're the best in the business, you're under the most amount of look and monitoring. Some people are going to perceive us in a very bad way. Other people are going to perceive us as saving kids' lives.
Litchfield is a prominent Republican fundraiser and was Utah Finance Committee co-chair during Mitt Romney's presidential bid. And the company Mitt Romney started, Bain Capital, owns a network of troubled teen programs called the Aspen Educational Group. What kinds of regulations exist today?
There's a patchwork of state regulations, but there really isn't very much. Some states on paper have very good regulations. Utah, on paper, the regulations look good, but they're very rarely enforced. Montana, I believe, is working on regulation because there were a series of abuses that were reported. But it's just very patchy.
Megan Stokes is the executive director of NATSAP, the National Association of Therapeutic Schools and Programs, a membership association for residential treatment centers, therapeutic boarding schools, and wilderness therapy programs. I asked her perspective on federal regulation, given what was uncovered in the congressional hearings over a decade ago.
We have changed. Originally, NATSAP was absolute, no, we don't want this regulation. This is not something we want to invite or anything along those lines. I think cooler heads have prevailed. We've looked at it. We've realized, you know what, this is something we can actually really work with. In 2008, there were very much a lack of regulation among the states. And if you look at the history, different states have really stepped it up and have had some really great oversight that they now provide, as well as regulations from everything from the amount of water a student has to have access to if they have access to a abuse hotline or an emergency line. Everything being covered under there. So stuff that was kind of brought up in the original bill are being addressed in the states.
Megan says that NATSAP does not condone unscientific, tough love approaches to therapy, including the way programs like CEDU used isolation and peer pressure to punish kids.
For NATSAP's position, it has been that that's not appropriate at all. This is not something that would be therapeutically based in a way that would ever help somebody.
Megan Stokes says that the troubled teen industry has evolved since 2008. I asked Maia about her hopes for the industry.
Well, I would like to see them require that people have a master's degree to run these groups and work with kids, and that would basically eliminate the industry overnight because they couldn't afford to do it. Realistically, I think that if a kid is troubled enough to require residential care, they should have a diagnosis and they should be going to treatment that is focused on dealing with that diagnosis. If they don't have a diagnosis, they don't have a problem serious enough to require residential care. So it's really an industry that shouldn't exist.
The congressional hearings into the so-called troubled teen industry were more than 12 years ago now. But if you Google therapeutic boarding school or wilderness program, you still get tons of hits. Programs that advertise what CEDU sold, that they can fix your kid. And if there's one constant in life, it's that kids and their parents will clash. And parents are often at a loss about what to do when they feel that their kids are heading down the wrong path. So when they see political leaders, movie stars, royalty even, promoting programs that promise to help, it's easy to understand why desperate parents are open to sending their kids away. But sadly, it seems that many are left regretting that choice.
The mistake we have is that I sent him to CEDU. We didn't know that it's such a best school, and we were fooled by them.
Daniel's parents don't need Maia Szalavitz to tell them that CEDU had sold them a false bill of goods. They don't believe that tough love was the answer to Daniel's struggles. Today, their focus is simply on finding him, or what happened to him.
I believe Daniel ran away by his own will. I believe that he ran down to San Bernardino first, and then ran down to San Diego next, and still staying in San Diego.
One reason the Ewens believe their son is still alive is because of a man who claims to have tracked down hundreds of kids who ran away from CEDU. That's next time on The Lost Kids.
So you receive a message on your cell phone, and what does it say?
It was in the first person that, hey, I'm Daniel. I don't want to be found.
This podcast was produced by David McDougall, Kathleen Goldhar, and me. Our associate producer is Max Miller. Sound design and mixing by Mitchell Stuart. Additional producing by Medium Anonymous and Todd Nilssen. Executive producing by Amanda McPhillips, Nathan Ament, Kathleen Goldhar, and myself. This is a UCP audio podcast. For more information, go to our website, ucpaudio.com.